Hercule Poirot and the Map, that showed a deleted place. Chapter 1. The crumpled map in the library. It was a leaden afternoon in the Wiltshire countryside, and in the ancient Casa Weatherden. The Gothic windows filtered a milky light that seemed to warm nothing. The chandeliers were lit despite the hour, and a subdued silence pervaded the room, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The approaching storm seemed to herald something more than rain. Lord Alistair Weatherden, an octogenarian aristocrat with a reputation as an eccentric retired cartographer, had been found dead that morning in his private library, slumped over, the desk where, according to his faithful housekeeper, Mrs. Claymore, he had been reviewing a set of old maps. The apparent cause, a heart attack, but the local inspector, the young and determined Inspector Denham, was not convinced. "Too many things don't add up," he told his assistant. "An old map torn from the file cabinet, a missing drawer key, and the screams the gardener heard in the middle of the night. I don't like this at all." Rumours began circulating among the residents of Elmsbridge almost instantly. They said the old man had discovered hidden treasure, that someone had murdered him for a secret buried underground. What no one expected was that Lady Judith Weatherden, the deceased's niece and current administrator of the estate, would discreetly send a telegram to London. The message was brief but powerful, urgent. Possible murder at Weatherden Hall, requesting assistance from Monsieur Hercule Poirot. His usual fee is due. Delicate situation. J. Weatherden. 2 days later, a black car appeared on the property's gravel driveway. A man of medium height stepped out, impeccably dressed in a pearl grey overcoat, a perfectly knotted tie, and a carefully waxed moustache that seemed to defy the very symmetry of the human face. The driver had barely opened the door when the man exclaimed, "But finally, this damp air is an insult to elegance. And those rose bushes, my God, someone has pruned them mercilessly. I must speak to the gardener." Lady Judith greeted him in the main hall, a room filled with family portraits and clocks that didn't keep exact time. Her composure was firm, but her eyes, reddish from recent crying, betrayed her effort. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot. I have no proof, but I know my uncle was killed. Mademoiselle." "There are things that don't require proof, but intuition," Poirot replied, placing his hand on his heart. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Judith recounted what had happened, how her uncle had been obsessed with an old map of Wiltshire showing a missing property, how he had become suspicious in his final days, and how a section of the map had been mysteriously scratched away, as if someone didn't want him to know what was there. Poirot tilted his head. "Where is that map now?" "In the library, although it's not the same anymore. Someone crumpled it, and a small piece is missing from the lower left corner. The erased part. Perfect. I need to see that library, and speak to everyone who was in the house the day your uncle died. Will you let me?" "Of course. There are 5 people besides me and Mrs. Claymore. My cousin Roland, always in financial straits. Miss Daphne Morell, a young historian researching family genealogy. Dr. Finch, who was tending to my uncle. And the gardener Hugh, who heard a scream in the night and says he dreamed of disturbed earth." Poirot smoothed his moustache and murmured, "1 death, 1 torn map, and 1 removed land. Very interesting. And as always, mademoiselle, Where others see chaos, Poirot sees order. As the storm finally broke over the rooftops of Weatherden Hall, a new order began to form in the Belgian detective's mind. But there still weren't enough pieces. Not yet. Chapter 2. The Library of Silent Questions. The library at Weatherden Hall smelled of old leather, beeswax, and an indefinable trace of damp earth. The walls were lined with bookshelves stacked with leather-bound volumes, and a large mahogany desk occupied the centre, still covered with the late Lord Alistair's papers. Hercule Poirot paused in the doorway with an expression mingling respect and appraisal. "A room like this," he murmured, "doesn't just hold books. It holds wishes, secrets, and sometimes clues." Lady Judith, a step behind him, remained silent as the detective began to examine the place. His eyes quickly scanned every corner with almost mathematical precision. Poirot walked over to the desk and pointed to a worn folder. "Is this the map in question?" "Yes, it was the last thing my uncle checked," Judith replied quietly. Poirot opened the folder with great care. The map was clearly old, fragile parchment, faded ink marks, and in the lower left corner an irregular stain where the paper had been scraped. "Funny," Poirot murmured, taking out his magnifying glass. "The scratch isn't fresh, but there's something else. Look here." "Mademoiselle, notice this slight glow?" Judith narrowed her eyes. "Varnish? Not exactly. It's wax." Someone tried to disguise the tampering with a protective layer. An ancient technique, and a clever one. Who had regular access to this room? My uncle, of course. Mrs. Claymore helped. Him with the books, and Daphne the historian came around sometimes to look at documents. But no one else had a key. Or so I thought. Poirot nodded, still looking at the map. "And the missing piece? Has it been found?" "No. We searched the entire room. Nothing." Poirot walked slowly around the room, taking in the window sills, the fireplace, the globe. Then he stopped in front of a locked glass case containing small measuring instruments. "Can you open this?" "Don't have the key. I suppose it's in one of the drawers," Judith began, but Poirot had already found the locked drawer. "But no. This is the problem Inspector Denham was talking about, isn't it? The key to this drawer is missing." "Exactly. And no one admits to having touched her." Poirot looked closely at the lock. Not forced, not damaged, only the key is missing. That suggests deliberate theft, not a hasty robbery. The rain pounded against the windows as Poirot sat, fingers intertwined, in an armchair facing the desk. "Tell me one more thing, mademoiselle. Did your uncle ever mention what was in this display case or locked drawer?" Judith hesitated. "You mentioned a valuable document, but I thought you were talking about it in a financial sense. Now I'm not sure." Poirot remained silent for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to the door. "I must speak to Miss Daphne Morel, and then to Gardiner Hugh. Both names intrigue me, one because of the intellectual proximity, the other because of dreams of turned earth. And then, mademoiselle, it will be the turn of the small grey cells. Do you think one of them?" Poirot didn't reply. He just smiled slightly and enigmatically, before disappearing down the corridor, his coat buttoned up to his neck. Behind him, the library fell silent again, as if patiently waiting its turn at the crime scene. Chapter 3. Gardener Hugh's Underground Words. The back garden of Weatherden Hall, despite the gloomy weather, maintained its structure of restrained beauty. The precisely trimmed hedges, damp gravel paths, and seasonal flowers revealed meticulous, almost obsessive attention. In the distance, Hercule Poirot watched the gardener digging near the oriental rosebush, his movements slow and ponderous, as if measuring the weight of his thoughts. "Mr. Hugh," Poirot said courteously as he approached, "may I steal a few minutes from you?" The gardener, a burly man with a sunburned face and eyes as grey as wet stone, turned slowly. He dropped his spade with a sigh and took off his hat. "It's because of old Lord Weatherden. I've already told the inspector everything I know." "Ah, but I'm not the inspector, monsieur. I'm Hercule Poirot, and I'm more interested in what you feels that what knows." Quenet, Hugh nodded with a slight shrug, wiping his hands with a rag. "You dreamed of disturbed earth, according to Miss Judith." Poirot began gently. "Did that happen on the night of the death?" Hugh looked at him sideways. "It's not something I like to talk about. They'll think I'm crazy. But yes, that night I had a strange dream. I was in this very garden, and someone, I couldn't see his face, was digging right here," he said, pointing to the ground beneath his feet. "He was digging desperately, and I woke up with a dry throat, as if I'd seen something I shouldn't have." Poirot bowed his head seriously, and he came to check the place out the next day. "I did. There was nothing. The ground was solid, but look at this." He bent down and pushed with the shovel, removing about 2 inches. Poirot knelt carefully, avoiding soiling his immaculate trousers. There, just beneath the surface, something unexpected emerged, a small, precisely folded piece of waxed paper. Hugh handed it to Poirot without a word. Poirot opened it delicately. "But yes, this is part of the map," murmured Poirot, examining the torn edge and the barely visible piece of drawing. "Did they bury him? Or was it thrown out the window, and the wind blew it in here?" Poirot suggested. "Or perhaps someone thought they were destroying evidence, and in their nervousness wasn't thorough enough." Hugh watched him closely. "And what does that piece show?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. Despite his deterioration, he could make out part of a word: strike. The rest was lost in a wet patch. "Could be greystone, gravel, or even graveyard," Poirot mused. "Be that as it may, this fragment is valuable. Thank you, Monsieur Hugh. And one last thing. Did you ever have any conflict with Lord Weatherden?" "No, sir. He was reserved but fair. Although, lately, he was afraid. I heard him speak, only some nights. He would say things like, 'They mustn't know,' or 'The place has been cursed since before I was born.'" Poirot nodded, frowning slightly. "And did you ever mention Miss Daphne?" "Morel?" Hugh hesitated. "The blonde girl. Yes, she came several times. She and Lord Weatherden talked for hours, not always about maps, sometimes about genetic memory, hidden inheritances, things I don't even understand. Interesting, much more interesting than it sounds." Poirot sat up, brushing a dusting of dirt from his trousers. Then he looked towards the house, his eyes twinkling under the overcast sky. "Thank you for your honesty, Monsieur Hugh. I advise you not to repeat any of this for now. As you rightly said, dreams can seem insane to those who don't know how to interpret them, but I have some experience with dreams that reveal truths. As Poirot walked away, carefully placing the fragment in his linen handkerchief, his thoughts fluttered like rain on glass. A buried fragment, delirious words about cursed places, and a young researcher interested in more than genealogy. Everything pointed to a story buried not only in paper, but also in blood. Chapter 4. Daphne Morell and inheritances not listed in Wills Poirot found the young lady Daphne Morell sitting in the glass-enclosed veranda overlooking the greenhouse, surrounded by tropical plants and a stack of books on British bloodlines. She wore a sober, unadorned blue dress, and her light hair was arranged precisely, as if each strand had its place in some invisible logic. The young woman looked up as she saw him approach, her expression immediately alert. "Monsieur Poirot," she said in a soft but firm voice, "Lady Judith told me you wanted to speak to me. About Lord Weatherden?" "Exactly. Thank you for your time, mademoiselle. I have the impression that you were a regular presence in this house before the sad event." "I've come here frequently these past few months." Daphne nodded, putting her book aside. "Lord Weatherden allowed me to study part of his private collection of old maps and family archives. He had exceptional knowledge and an even more astonishing memory." Poirot sat opposite her, elegantly crossing one leg over the other. "And yet some say that in his final weeks he talked to himself and seemed fearful. Did you notice anything unusual?" Daphne hesitated for only a second. "He was more reserved, yes. He talked about things I didn't fully understand. He said there were errors in the records, that something had been buried twice, once in the ground and once on paper. I thought it was a metaphor. And you, mademoiselle, what exactly were you looking for in those documents?" Daphne's eyes narrowed cautiously. "The Weatherden family is one of the oldest in Wiltshire. Their lineage has obscure ramifications, connections to other extinct houses. My research was for academic purposes. I'm preparing a thesis on British genealogy and maps as vehicles of symbolic power." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And did you find what you were looking for?" The young woman hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Yes, and no. I found a pattern. A name that appears and disappears in successive records. Eliza G. No one mentions her directly, but she's implied in marginalia, personal letters, even a 19th century map. A property marked as hers, then crossed out, literally crossed out." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And could it be the place erased from the map?" "Exactly. Gravermore Hollow, a plot of land between the Weatherden border and the former Greville lands. A now abandoned site not listed in any current land register. When I asked about it, Lord Weatherden told me some things aren't inherited. They're hidden." "Very interesting, mademoiselle. Do you know Roland, Lady Judith's cousin?" "I know him by sight. We crossed paths a couple of times. He always seemed uneasy, like he was afraid he was being watched." Poirot stood up slowly, thoughtfully. "One last question, Miss Morell. Did you find any reference to an alternative will or any mention of unofficial heirs among your documents?" Daphne seemed to tense up. "I saw an unsigned letter dated 5 years ago. It simply said, if the map falls into the wrong hands, the name of Eliza G. will cease to exist forever. But if anyone searches honestly, they will find the forgotten legacy. Poirot put his hand to his moustache, thoughtful. And that letter? It was with other papers in a private correspondence box belonging to the deceased. Mrs. Claymore allowed me to look through it once, but I never saw it again. I suspect it disappeared, like so many other things in this house. Thank you, miss. You have been very helpful. Poirot left the gallery with a leisurely step, his mind slowly stitching together the scattered threads. The erased name, the non-existent property, the unsigned letter, the fragment of map found underground, and a genealogist too precise not to have touched more than was permitted. As the pieces began to fall into place, Poirot knew he shouldn't move them just yet. Not yet. Before the truth came, the psychological game would come, and in that game he had already made his first move. Chapter 5. Roland and the alibi built on debt. The cousin, Roland Weatherden. He was not an easy man to find in the vast house of his ancestors. Poirot finally located him in a secondary room near the north wing, a space forgotten by time, where ancient musical instruments and faded portraits shared its silent retreat. Roland sat in a battered velvet armchair, smoking a thin cigar with a distracted air. "Monsieur Poirot, I presume," he said without rising, casting a tired but sharp look. "That's correct, sir. I'm told you were one of the few residents in the ordeal house when Lord Weatherden died. Happened," Roland repeated with a sour smile. What an elegant way to avoid the word murder. Poirot approached without responding to the provocation, observing the ashes carefully deposited on the edge of a porcelain ashtray. "Were you close to your uncle?" Roland huffed. "As close as you can get to a man who believed his lineage was more important than any living human being. I was an administrative nuisance, not a nephew. And yet you were here, at Weatherden Hall, at the time of his death. I was visiting, a visit that coincided, oddly enough, with the writing of his new will." Poirot frowned slightly. "A new testament?" Roland exhaled the smoke slowly, his expression bitter. "Yes, he drafted it privately with his lawyer. He never told me who he'd be leaving the inheritance to, but it wasn't hard to imagine he'd exclude me." "And that worried you, Monsieur Poirot?" Roland said, sitting up straight. "I have debts, many, but I am not a murderer. If I had wanted to steal something from my uncle, I would have done it in his lifetime, with sweet words and false respect, not with poison or violence. He knew me. That's why he never believed me dangerous." "Were you in the house the night Lord Weatherden died?" "I was sleeping in my room. Miss Morel passed by in the hall around midnight. I heard her. Mrs. Claymore will say I didn't go out." Poirot looked at him more closely. "And did you hear any unusual noises? A scream, perhaps? Just rain and branches hitting the windows? Nothing else?" Poirot allowed a brief silence to pass before bowing towards him. "Do you know a place called Gravermore Hollow?" The reaction was subtle but visible. The cigar trembled slightly in his fingers. "An old vacant lot. My uncle mentioned it once as part of a family dispute. Why? Perhaps because it appears on an altered map. a section of which has been mysteriously removed. And perhaps because that land was once linked to someone named Eliza G. Roland was silent for a few seconds, then put his cigarette in the ashtray with a gesture of boredom. "Look, Poirot, I'll tell you the little I know. That woman, Eliza, was a scandal in her time. A distant relative, probably illegitimate. My uncle spoke of her in his most recent delirium, as if her mere existence dishonoured the whole family. He said there was something buried with her that must remain hidden." "And do you know what it was?" "No, but my intuition tells me it wasn't just about land or documents. It was something more personal." Poirot stood up, smoothing the sleeves of his jacket. "Thank you, Mr. Roland. Your sincerity, albeit belated, is helpful. I beg you not to leave the property for the moment. Don't worry." Roland replied bitterly, "I have nowhere else to go." As he left the room, Poirot pondered every word, every hesitation, every gesture. Roland was impulsive, yes, and clearly desperate, but it didn't fit with the cold precision behind the buried fragment, the locked drawer, the missing letter. No, there was another kind of mind at play. A mind that understood the value of the symbolic and the historical. Someone who knew what it meant to erase a name from a piece of paper, to erase it from history. And just as Poirot entered the main corridor, Mrs. Claymore approached him with a pale face. "Monsieur Poirot, the lock on Lord Weatherden's desk drawer has just been forced. It's empty." Poirot stopped dead in his tracks. Another piece of the puzzle had just moved. Chapter 6. The Empty Drawer and the Traces of History. Poirot immediately headed for the library. Mrs. Claymore followed him with hurried, nervous steps, her apron slightly wrinkled, her hands trembling. "I didn't hear anything, monsieur," she said in a halting voice. "I was looking through the books in the north section when I noticed the desk door was ajar. I thought you'd been there, but—" "No, madame," Poirot interrupted with firm politeness. "I haven't touched the drawer since my arrival. Did you notice if anyone else entered the library while you were working?" "I didn't see anyone, but I heard footsteps, light ones. I could have mistaken them for Miss Morel's." Poirot frowned as he bent down at the desk. The lock had been broken cleanly, with no splinters or signs of fumbling. Precise work. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for, and they knew they couldn't afford to leave it there any longer. The inside of the drawer was simple. Polished wood, unlined. There were no papers, no envelopes, and no trace of dust to indicate what had been inside. Only a faint trace of wax on the bottom, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. Poirot took out a white linen handkerchief and gently wiped it over the surface. The texture of the wax confirmed his suspicion. The missing contents had probably been sealed, protected. An envelope, perhaps, or an important document. "Are there any more copies of the keys to the desk?" "Just one that was in the top drawer," Mrs. Claymore replied. "But it's been there forever. Or so I thought." Poirot stood up with slow, meticulous movements. So, someone else had access to the copy. Someone who knew the contents of this drawer, were more valuable than they appeared, and now they've made it disappear. "Do you think it was Miss Morel?" Claymore asked, whispering as if he was afraid the walls could hear. Poirot didn't reply. Instead, he walked slowly through the library, looking at the bookshelves, the tapestries, The frames hanging above the fireplace. He stopped before a portrait of a younger Lord Alistair, wearing a colonial explorer's uniform and a rigid expression. His gaze was straying off the canvas. Who painted this picture? A local artist, about 30 years ago. Lord Alistair insisted that the background show part of his favourite map. The one of Wiltshire from 1831. Poirot narrowed his eyes. There it was, a section of the map reproduced on the canvas behind Alistair's right shoulder. Small, but sharp, and in the lower corner, the same space that had been torn from the real map. But this version wasn't scratched. The name was still, clearly legible, Gravermore Hollow. Ah, but yes, Poirot whispered, his moustache seeming to curl slightly with satisfaction. Some people erase names from the paper. Others forget to erase them from the art. He returned to Mrs. Claymore. I need to speak with Judith again, and with the family lawyer. If there's a new will, it must have been recorded somewhere. And if not, then someone made it disappear, just like the contents of this drawer. Mrs. Claymore nodded, confused but obedient. I'm going to call her right away. Poirot was left alone once again in the heart of the library. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to listen, not to the sounds of the present, but to the echoes of the past, an ancient voice saying, "Some things are not inherited, they are hidden." The story of Gravermore Hollow slowly emerged, like a corpse pushing up from beneath the earth. And Poirot knew, with his meticulous certainty, that Lord Weatherden's death was merely the final link in a chain begun decades earlier, a chain that someone was now trying to break or bury forever. At that instant, a shrill scream tore through the air from the east wing. Poirot left the library without a word, his footsteps echoing urgently on the marble. Chapter 7. The Scream, in the East Wing and the Red Ink Hand. Poirot didn't run. He never ran, but his firm, quick steps brought him to the east wing of Weatherden Hall with remarkable speed. Mrs. Claymore followed at some distance, panting, while voices began to emerge from the corridors. Confusion, fear, and a name repeated in strained whispers. "Daphne, are you okay? Someone call a doctor." Poirot turned a corner and found Lady Judith kneeling on the marble floor beside him, Daphne Morell, who was leaning against the wall, visibly shaken. Her face was chalk white, but she didn't look hurt. What was striking was her right hand, completely stained with red ink, as if he had dipped his fingers into a spilled inkwell. "It's not blood!" Judith exclaimed urgently, seeing Poirot's expression. "It's ink? A broken bottle?" "Where?" asked Poirot in a low voice, approaching gently. Judith pointed to the half-open door of Lord Weatherden's study, just next door. Poirot entered. The air smelled of damp paper and fresh ink. On the desk was Ed Spotwitch stretched out like a wounded flower, soaking several papers, and next to it the broken remains of a glass jar. "I tripped over something," Daphne said, her voice strained. "I was coming to get a book Mrs. Claymore let me check out. I walked in and it was dark. I hit the desk and then the bottle fell. I didn't see anyone, but I swear I heard running footsteps right after." Poirot studied the young woman closely. Her breathing was laboured, her skirt was slightly wrinkled from falling, and her blouse showed a small splash of ink at the collar. But the most curious thing was the crumpled piece of paper she was still holding in her other hand, almost without realizing it. "What is that, mademoiselle?" asked Poirot calmly. Daphne looked at the paper, as if noticing it for the first time. Then she handed it to the detective. It was a page torn from a diary, dated 10 years ago. The handwriting was recognizable, that of Lord Alistair Weatherden. "Today I hid the document. It wasn't enough to destroy the first. The second is protected by oblivion. Grievermore never existed, not officially, but in my blood, in my name, it still resonates. She will not return." Poirot folded the sheet carefully and put it in his jacket. Then he went to the desk and examined the stained papers. Among them, a partially soaked envelope revealed a letterhead with gold lettering, "Sedgwick and Moresby, family lawyers." The ink had almost completely ruined it, but a line at the bottom could still be read. "According to his will, all property related to Grevemore Hollow shall—" "Holy Virgin!" Poirot murmured. Someone tried to eliminate evidence, but they were too late, or perhaps too early. He turned to Judith and Daphne, who were watching him with expectant eyes. "Mademoiselle Morel, are you sure you didn't see anyone else in the studio?" "I swear. I only heard the footsteps as he left. Quick, light, as if they didn't want to be heard." "Did anyone see Roland?" Poirot asked suddenly. Judith frowned. "He was in the music room," he said, "practicing piano, but I don't know if anyone actually heard him." Poirot sighed and smoothed his moustache. "There's a pattern. Names are being hidden, documents are being destroyed, places are being erased from the map. And now, rooms are being ransacked with the desperation of someone who feels the truth is about to come out." As he spoke, a metallic sound came from the corridor. Poirot came out of the study and met Hugh, the gardener, who was approaching with a shadowy face. "Mr. Poirot, I found something else at the edge of the lot, where the earth had been disturbed. Ammetal box, very old. It's closed, but it doesn't seem to have a lock." Poirot tilted his head. A box without a lock, hidden in a foreign land, just as history tries to escape. And for the first time since his arrival, he smiled widely. "Ladies, I think we're about to unearth more than just forgotten property. We're about to unearth a buried truth with a name and surname." Chapter 8. The Grievermore Box and the Name That Never Died. The metal box, rusted with age and still covered in dried mud, rested on a table in the garden shed, under the dim light of an oil lamp. Poirot studied it with the fascination of an archaeologist before a forbidden artifact. Lady Judith, Daphne, and the gardener Hugh stood nearby, expectant. Only Roland was conspicuous by his absence. "Where exactly did you find it, Monsieur Hugh?" asked Poirot, without taking his eyes off the object. "Near the oriental rosebush. A little further back, where the soil is less tilled." The shovel sounded hollow, and there it was, the gardener explained. "I cleaned it only on the outside, as you asked." "You've done well," said Poirot. "Nothing must contaminate its interior." He took a linen handkerchief, placed it over his hand, and pushed the lid. Contrary to all expectations, there was no resistance. With a soft creak, the box opened. Inside was a worn leather folder, wrapped in a cloth embroidered with feminine initials. G. Daphne covered her mouth. Eliza G. Poirot nodded and carefully removed the contents of the folder. There were yellowed documents, letters signed in an elegant feminine hand, and a handwritten note entitled Memories from the Hollow. On the back, a more recent note in Lord Weatherden's handwriting. These pages must not see the light of day while I live. Gravermore died with me. Poirot skimmed through them quickly and accurately. The memoirs recounted the life of Eliza Greville, the illegitimate daughter of Alistair's great-grandfather. A woman rejected by the Weatherden family after an inheritance scandal. Eliza had been exiled to a hidden estate, where she lived in solitude, marked by scorn and the promise of a denied lineage. But there was something more. "My God!" Poirot murmured. Judith leaned toward him. "What does it say?" "A confession," Poirot replied. "Eliza wasn't the only one related to him. She was the legitimate heir for 5 years, according to grandfather, Weatherden's will. But that will was hidden, secretly annulled, all to preserve the family name. Alistair discovered it in his youth, and he never forgave him, not his father and not himself." Poirot took out another more modern document on legal letterhead. A will dated 5 weeks before Lord Weatherden's death. It's signed, witnessed, and here it states that everything related to the Gravermore estate, including the land, history, and documents, will be bequeathed to the person who can restore the name of Eliza G. to the family memory. "Daphne?" Judith whispered. Poirot looked at the young genealogist, whose face showed a mixture of surprise, fear, and something deeper. Recognition. "You were looking for more than facts, weren't you? You were looking for justice. Maybe blood. My great-grandmother was Eliza's daughter," Daphne finally said, her voice calm. "We were always told not to speak of her, that her name brought shame. But I grew up with the story whispered in the halls of my childhood. When I learned of the map collection and the hidden lineage, I came to find her, and I did." "Did Lord Weatherden know?" "He sensed it. In our last conversations, he asked me if a surname had value when it's written on ruins. I didn't understand then, but I do now." Poirot closed the folder with precision. "It wasn't you who broke into the drawer, or spilled the ink, or removed the first fragment of the map, but someone else did, someone who saw you as a threat, someone who wanted Eliza G. to remain dead on paper." At that moment, Roland appeared in the doorway of the shed. His face was pale and his eyes were wild. "What did they find?" asked, feigning a naturalness that was now useless. Poirot watched him calmly. "The truth, Monsieur Roland, one that leaves you out. But fear not, it is not a crime to be excluded from a will. The crime is to erase a history, and fail in the attempt." Roland swallowed, taking a step back. But Poirot didn't stop him. "There's still time for you, like Weatherden, to decide whether you're going to continue covering up past mistakes, or confront them." And with that, Poirot closed the box with a slight gesture. A forgotten story, a name erased, and now restored. Chapter 9. Lord Weatherden's Last Night. A fog had descended on the gardens of Weatherden Hall, covering the hedges and paths with a thick, damp veil. Inside, Poirot settled into the music-room, where a dead fire lay in the grate. Around him, the protagonists of the drama gathered slowly, summoned without words but with an inevitable urgency. Judith, with a sombre but dignified expression, sat by the window. Daphne, her fingers still stained with ink, stood near the fire, not looking directly at anyone. Roland arrived last. His shoulders slumped, as if an invisible weight hung around his neck. Poirot stood, his small but firm figure, like a needle pointing to the truth. When everyone was silent, he began to speak. "My friends, this story didn't begin with a murder, nor with a robbery. It began long before that, with a buried family injustice, and a conscience unable to forget. Everyone was watching him. Only the faint ticking of the grandfather clock interrupted his words. Lord Weatherden discovered in his youth that his ancestor had disinherited Eliza Greville, his half-sister, for reasons of blood and social convenience. The young woman was sent to live in Gravenmore Hollow, and her existence was gradually erased from the records. But the old lord made a mistake. He signed an initial will that granted Eliza part of the family estate. Poirot began to walk slowly around the room. That document was hidden, but echoes of that truth survived. Alistair discovered them among maps, letters and rumours, and he chose to remain silent, for years, until he met Miss Morell. Daphne looked up for the first time. She didn't speak, but her eyes confirmed the story. You, mademoiselle, came looking for Eliza, not just as a historian, but as a descendant, and Lord Weatherden understood that. Hence his decision to correct the past, to draft a new will, to include in it the acknowledgement and restitution of the erased name. Poirot stopped in front of Roland. But not everyone took it with the same composure. "Right, sir." Roland shifted in his seat. I didn't kill him. I didn't do anything." "Precisely, monsieur," said Poirot gently. "You know he killed him, because Lord Weatherden wasn't murdered in the traditional sense. He died of a heart attack, brought on by a conflict, a confrontation the night before." Everyone looked at him tense. That night Lord Weatherden argued with someone in the library. He didn't scream, but footsteps were heard. The next day he was found dead. What they didn't know was that Lord Weatherden's heart was weak. The doctor warned them. Any emotional shock could be fatal. And that shock occurred when he discovered someone had stolen the map fragment and was threatening to destroy the will. Roland lowered his head. "I sneaked in that night. I didn't touch him. We just argued. I told him everything he did was out of guilt, that he couldn't give the land to a stranger. And he got furious. He kicked me out, and I didn't come back. I didn't think he'd die." "But he died," Judith said without raising her voice. Poirot nodded. "And then, monsieur, you acted. You went back in. You hid the map fragment, then buried it. You stole the key from the drawer and planned to destroy the will. But you couldn't find it. Someone, probably Mrs. Claymore, unbeknownst to her, had stored the most sensitive documents elsewhere. When you tried to retrieve what you thought was a key envelope, you found only useless papers or ink." "I don't understand." Daphne chimed in. "So Roland isn't a murderer?" "No, mademoiselle, but you are guilty of manipulation and of trying to suppress the truth, which amounts to continuing the original injustice." Poirot turned to Judith. "Lady Judith, you can decide whether this story ends here, or whether Lord Weatherden's will be executed accordingly." She nodded slowly. It will be executed. Eliza's memory will be restored. And her offspring too. Roland stood up, trembling. And me, am I banished? You've exiled yourself, monsieur, Poirot said gently. But perhaps you still have time to make amends. The silence that followed wasn't one of condemnation, but of understanding. At Weatherden Hall, for the first time in generations, the ghosts of the past were beginning to rest. Poirot, with his hands clasped behind his back, turned to the clock and murmured, "Sometimes the crime isn't in the death, but in erasing a name that should never have died." Chapter 10. A Legacy of Shadows and the Final Reflection. The next day, a strange silence had settled over the halls of Weatherden Hall. It was different from the silence that had reigned after Lord Weatherden's death. That had been tense, vibrant, full of suspicion. The silence now was heavy, but serene, as if the house itself knew that an old wound had just healed, even if it left a scar. In the library, Poirot was alone. The fireplace was lit, and on the coffee table lay the last vestiges of a hidden past, Eliza's manuscript, the will signed by Lord Weatherden, and the now empty metal box. The morning mist filtered through the windows like a silent presence. Poirot delicately leafed through Eliza Greville's memoirs for the last time. They told me my name didn't exist, that it shouldn't appear in books, on land, or on maps. But my memory lives on, even though they hide me underground. My story isn't just mine. It belongs to those yet to be born. Poirot closed the notebook with an almost ritualistic bow. Inside, he had discovered not only an injustice, but also an emotional truth. The human resistance to being forgotten, to being erased, as if they had never existed. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Lady Judith, dressed with sober elegance, her face marked by fatigue but also by a firm determination. "Monsieur Poirot," she said calmly, "the family lawyer has been contacted. There are no more obstacles. The will be validated. Eliza's story will be incorporated into the family register." Poirot nodded with a slight inclination of his head. "It's a gesture of justice. More than that, it's a gesture of truth. Turque, blood that flows down a line, is no less worthy for having been written in the margins." Judith approached the fire, watching the flames for a few seconds. "Et Roland?" "He left this morning," Poirot replied. "He didn't run away. He just left. He said he needed time. I believe him." Judith nodded without answering. "And Daphne? She's decided to stay a little longer. She wants to help me reorganize the family archive. She says there are still stories hidden among the maps." Poirot smiled. "A worthy task, and with someone like her, I doubt anything will stay buried for long." There was a long silence. Only the crackling of the fireplace filled the air. "You know, Monsieur Poirot," Judith said finally, "my uncle was a difficult man, but I think, deep down, he knew that the right thing to do wasn't to preserve history, but to correct it." "Exactly, mademoiselle," Poirot replied. "There are those who believe that history is an immovable stone, but in reality it is clay, and it must be shaped with justice, not with pride." Judith looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "Thanks for everything." Poirot stood up slowly, buttoned his coat, and took his hat from the peg by the door. His steps were soft and ceremonious. Before leaving, he paused and looked once more at the library, at the portrait of Lord Weatherden, and at the partially restored map. "A place was erased," he said quietly, "but a name and a name has been restored, and with it a part of what this family had unknowingly lost." And so, with his perfectly polished shoes clicking on the marble, Hercule Poirot left Weatherden Hall, leaving behind a lighter, less silent house, and finally at peace. Epilogue. The Echo of Graver Moor. Weeks later, a light rain was falling on the fields of Wiltshire. Through the morning mist, a solitary figure was walking along the path that bordered the old boundary of the lands of Gravemoor. Hollow, she wore mud-covered leather boots, a wine-coloured scarf, and in her hands a familiar leather folder, Eliza Greville's. Daphne Morell stopped at the foot of a small stone monolith, barely visible in the weeds. No one would have noticed it before. It was little more than a cairn, but beneath the earth, hidden for generations, they had found what appeared to be an ancestral marker. The inscription, worn with age, simply read, E.G. Something began, here that couldn't be erased. Daphne bent down and placed the folder on the stone with reverent gentleness. She wouldn't leave it there, of course, but she needed that moment. A symbol, a reparation. Behind her, the sound of soft footsteps on the wet grass didn't startle her. She turned around with a calm smile. "Did you know I would return, monsieur?" Poirot, the Belgian detective, impeccable even in the fog and mud, bowed slightly in a polite greeting. "Mademoiselle, I couldn't leave England without making sure everything was properly arranged. Not in the archives alone, but here," he said, pointing a delicate finger at his temple. "And here," he added, placing his hand on his chest. Daphne nodded, looking down. "I've decided to write about Eliza, but not as an academic appendix. It will be a story, a personal narrative. I want her name to be heard again. I want the forgotten one to be remembered again." Poirot smiled. "All right, that's true justice, isn't it? Not that of the courts, but that of memory." They walked together a few steps toward the entrance to the old land. In the distance, the scaffolding and tents of local researchers rose. Judith had allowed a group of archaeologists to examine the remains of Gravemoor Hollow. The land was no longer off limits. "And tell me, mademoiselle," said Poirot, pausing, "have you reread the letter Eliza left at the end of the manuscript?" "The last page. I read it this morning," Daphne replied. "It says, 'If anyone ever finds me, I don't ask them to celebrate me, just don't shut me up.' And we won't." Poirot nodded slowly. "No, not any more." They both stood in silence, staring at the field that had once been erased from all maps. It was no longer a void, no longer a nameless hollow. Now it was a story told, a known truth, an echo that, though soft, would continue to resonate. "Good," Poirot said finally, taking out his pocket watch. "It's time to catch my train. Eliza's memory is in good hands, and I have another mystery waiting for me in Geneva." A crime? Not exactly. A stolen painting, a heartbroken widow, and a parrot that sings in Latin. It will be, as always, Very interesting." Daphne laughed, and Poirot, satisfied, took his leave with a courteous gesture. And so, in the mists of Gravemore Hollow, justice had been served, not with handcuffs, not with trials, but with the restoration of something infinitely more valuable, a name. Postlude, the last words of Lord Weatherden. A month after the closure of the Gravemore case, while the tabloid press was still debating the details of a phantom inheritance, and academic circles were celebrating the discovery of a deleted genealogy, a package arrived at the door of the apartment of Hercule Poirot in London. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple ribbon. No return address, no letter, just a label written in shaky handwriting. To Monsieur Poirot, what I couldn't say in life. Poirot, always sceptical of surprises in the mail, carefully untied the package. Inside he found a hardback notebook, covered in grey velvet, with the Weatherden family crest embossed in faded gold. It was a personal diary, dated in the last months of life of Lord Alastair Weatherden. Poirot settled into his armchair, with a steaming cup of herbal tea, and began to read. The entries were uneven, sometimes long, sometimes brief and confusing. But as he progressed, the pages revealed a man haunted by the ghosts of his lineage, fragments of memory, remorse, and above all, fear. History is written by those who survive, but silence is dictated by cowards. I was both. I saw in the girl's eyes, Daphne, the same fierceness that Eliza had in the letters. The same need to be acknowledged, to not be treated like a shadow. And who am I to deny it again? But it was the last entry, written in a shaky hand and faded ink, that completely captured the detective's attention. Tonight I face the truth. Roland has discovered that I intend to leave out his part. I heard him force the library door. I do not fear death, but I do fear perpetual silence. If I do not live to see the dawn, let it be known. Gravemore existed. Eliza lived, and she was loved, though not publicly. In a letter hidden in my first map of Wiltshire, I signed what I never said, that she was blood of my blood. Poirot slowly closed the diary, allowing the silence of his apartment to envelop him. Outside, the murmur of the city continued its indifferent course, but at that moment another voice joined the chorus of time. "Ah," murmured Poirot, "that's it. The heart doesn't die with the body. Sometimes it survives in the ink." He took the journal and placed it on his personal bookshelf, right next to his most intimate cases, where only a few volumes rested. He didn't catalogue it. He didn't mention it in his reports. He simply put it away, and in doing so he understood something else, that justice isn't always about convictions, but about giving voice to those who were forced into silence. And so, with the clock striking 10:23, Hercule Poirot closed his eyes for a moment and thought of a map, a name, a field covered in fog, a place erased, a place that now, in his memory, would never disappear again. Extra chapter. The keeper of the silent archive, the clock at the National Archives of Wales, read 11:45, when Daphne Morell handed her credentials to the receptionist. The air in the room was thick with history. Pages bound with the dust of centuries, shelves that seemed to go on forever, and a silence that didn't ask for respect. It demanded it. Room C. Special family manuscripts, the attendant indicated, without looking up. "Third door on the left." Daphne nodded. She carried a small leather satchel containing certified copies of the documents found at Weatherden Hall. Lord Alistair's will, Eliza Greville's manuscripts, the letters, and the original map with the restored section of the map. Grievermore Hollow. The decision to publicly archive everything had been a joint one between her, Lady Judith, and the family lawyer. But the process was long, and the story was still incomplete. Room C was smaller than I imagined. Just 2 old wooden tables, a green lamp swinging from the ceiling, and an elderly archivist with thick glasses and a look that seemed to have seen it all. "Miss Morell," the man said as he stood up slowly. "I'm glad you came in person. We received the digital advance, but we didn't know you'd be bringing the originals." "Yes, I wanted to oversee the sorting myself," Daphne replied, carefully placing the briefcase on the table. "This archive isn't just a historical collection, it's a repair." The man nodded with unexpected respect. He opened his briefcase one by one and arranged the documents with hands as trembling as they were precise. When he reached Eliza's manuscript, he stopped. "Can I read a page?" "Of course," Daphne replied, suppressing an emotion she didn't want to show. The archivist read quietly for a few minutes. Then he looked up with a strange expression. "You know, about 20 years ago, someone came looking for this name, Eliza G. She brought clippings, maps. She left frustrated. She didn't find anything. She said a Weatherden had promised to show her something, but she never came back." Daphne froze. "Do you remember your name?" "Only that he was young, and a foreigner, maybe French or Belgian. He had a moustache, memorable." Daphne laughed, helplessly. "Poirot. Sorry? Nothing. Just the most meticulous detective who ever lived. He was also seeking justice for Eliza, before he even knew I existed." The archivist nodded with a slight smile. Then, carefully, he numbered the documents, placed them in official archive folders, and sealed the file with a label. "Grievermore Hollow. Restored Legacy. File 153 EG. It's official," he said. "The name exists again." Daphne didn't respond. She just gently ran her fingers over the cover of the folder, as if by touching it she could finally say goodbye to a ghost that had been locked away in oblivion for generations. As I walked out of the building, the grey Cardiff sky was beginning to clear, and a ray of sunlight cut through the clouds like an invisible signature. Daphne looked up, wrapped her coat around her and smiled. Because now, in the records of history, Eliza Greville lived, and that, in the words of a great little detective, was all that mattered. Final chapter: The Little Grey Cells and the Whole Truth. Evening was falling gently over London when Hercule Poirot called a final meeting in the main drawing-room of Weatherden Hall. Golden rays of sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows on the Persian carpet, as if the light itself wished to hear what was about to be revealed. Sitting in front of him were Judith Weatherden, firm but expectant, Daphne Morell, serene with a newly tempered determination, Roland, restless and with a tense face, and the Mrs. Claymore, discreet in a corner, like part of the furniture, but more attentive than anyone. Poirot, impeccable in his light grey suit, and blue silk tie, smoothed his moustache one last time before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a peculiar investigation, not because of the nature of the crime, but because of its subtlety. The victim, not a body, but a story, and like any true crime, it has a motive, an opportunity, and a perpetrator." He paused, letting silence fall over the room. The first element was the map. Someone altered it to erase a specific location. Grievermore Hollow. Why? Because that place is linked to a name that was meant to disappear. Eliza Greville. He turned to Daphne. "You came looking for that name. But more than that, you came to give it back because she knew, from family stories, that Eliza wasn't a shadow, but flesh and blood. Her great-grandmother." Daphne nodded without speaking. Lord Weatherden knew it. At first he feared it. But finally he accepted it. That's why he drew up a new will. A will in which he acknowledged without ambiguity that Eliza was robbed, and that her descendants deserved to recover what they were denied. Poirot turned slowly towards Roland. "And this is where you come in, monsieur. You heard rumours. You saw your inheritance vanishing, and you acted. You stole the map fragment. You hid the key in the drawer, and you tried to erase the will." "I didn't make it," Roland interrupted, his voice trembling. "It was all too late." Poirot nodded. "That's right, because history has allies, even among objects. When you tried to tamper with the drawer, the will was already in the hands of Mrs. Claymore, who had stored it following the deceased's instructions. And when you buried the map fragment, Monsieur Hugh, the gardener, found it. Eliza's memoirs, the Lord's confession, the story. It all came back." He approached the centre of the room and stopped next to Lord Alistair's portrait. "But Lord Weatherden's death remains key. He died of a heart attack. Of natural causes? Yes. But themament, it was triggered by a confrontation, by the discovery of Roland's betrayal. There's no blood on his hands, but there is a weight on his conscience." Roland closed his eyes. Judith watched him with a mixture of sadness and disapproval. "And yet," Poirot continued, "this is not a case of punishment, but of revelation. Roland is not a murderer. He is a man desperate to hold on to a place he believed to be his. But the real culprit was the silence of previous generations." Poirot turned to everyone. "Today, that silence has been broken. Eliza once again has a name, a place, and a voice. And thanks to Miss Morel, her story will officially be incorporated into the archives of this house and this country." Daphne spoke for the first time. "I will. On paper, on file, out loud." Poirot smiled. "All right, because erased names don't return on their own. They require someone to call them. And you, mademoiselle, have rightly called." There was a long silence, and then Lady Judith stood up. "From this day forward, Grievermore Hollow will be restored as a legitimate part of the Weatherden legacy. Daphne will have her place, and Eliza's story will be acknowledged, not as a footnote, as a full chapter." Poirot, satisfied, picked up his hat and walking stick. "So, my friends, my work here is done. An injustice has been righted, not with a gun or fingerprints, but with the tiny grey cells, and the truth that refuses to die." As he stepped out through the great oak door, the sun touched the fields of Grevemore, and a gentle breeze stirred the branches of the nearby oaks. Poirot paused for a moment, closed his eyes, and murmured to himself, "Crimes from the past are the hardest to solve, because their victims don't scream. But if you listen carefully, you always hear the echoes."